When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the chipped teacup in front of me, and nodded. "Of course," I said softly, though my hands were trembling. Inside, it felt like the walls of my life were collapsing, but out loud, I was calm. I had thought my family would always be my safe place. My mother, my sister, my children, they were my world. But that day I realized that sometimes the people we love the most can hurt us in ways we never imagined. My sister. She had always been competitive, yes, but I never thought she could take something so precious from me. My mother's love. I remember the sound of the front door closing behind her. It echoed through the empty house like a warning. I could still feel the warmth of my mother's hug from that morning, a hug that now seemed like it belonged to someone else. My heart ached quietly, and I wondered if I had been blind all these years, or if she had been patient and silent in her favoritism, sitting there. I thought about all the small moments, the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet evenings where we shared tea and stories. My sister had always been there too, smiling in photos, laughing at jokes. But behind that smile, I didn't know there was a plan, a subtle, creeping shadow that would one day leave me feeling invisible in my own family. I wanted to scream, to run after my mother and beg her to see me. But something inside me whispered to stay quiet, to let the pain sink in fully. And as I sat there, the rain outside beginning to tap against the windows, I realized this story, my story, was about more than betrayal. It was about love, loss, and the quiet ways we survive when the people we trust the most turn away. I grew up in a small, cozy house, one that smelled of baking bread and fresh flowers. My mother was a kind woman, always busy with some little task for the family, yet she always had time to sit and listen if you needed her. My sister Lila was 2 years older than me. I admired her in many ways. She was confident, outgoing, and seemed to glide through life without the small stumbles that I always felt. Our family was simple. My father had passed when I was young, leaving my mother to raise us on her own. She worked hard, often waking before the sun rose to make sure we had breakfast, clean clothes, and a home that felt safe. I loved her fiercely, and so did Lila. But I think somewhere along the line, our love for her became a contest, though none of us admitted it. I was quieter than Lila. I loved the small joys, watering plants, cooking, reading letters from old friends. Lila loved attention, at school, at home, even among relatives. She always knew how to make my mother laugh, how to make her notice her first. I never minded sharing that love. I thought naively that there was enough for all of us. I married young, and soon I had children of my own. My mother was thrilled, and I cherished every visit where she came to see us, holding my little ones on her lap and whispering stories from when I was a child. I thought our bond was unshakable, but it was during those visits that I began to notice subtle changes. Lila would arrive too, smiling that same perfect smile, offering to help. At first I appreciated her support, but slowly I began to notice how my mother would hang on her every word. She would brush off my suggestions, laugh at Lila's jokes, and sometimes even glance at me with a kind of impatience I didn't understand. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mother was just tired, or maybe Lila had grown more charming over the years. The tension began with small things. A misplaced item that Lila found and returned, a comment about my parenting that seemed casual but left a sting, or my mother asking Lila's advice before even hearing mine. It was subtle, quiet, and I didn't want to confront it because I loved my sister and my mother. I wanted to believe that we were all still one family, bound by love. But the cracks were forming, invisible at first, like tiny lines on a porcelain teacup. And I didn't notice how deep they would eventually grow. As my children grew, I began to notice the subtle differences in how my mother treated us. With Lila, there was laughter, shared secrets, and long conversations that seemed to stretch into the night. With me, there was kindness, yes, but often a polite distance, a careful measuring of words. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself that love isn't always shown the same way, that maybe my mother just related to Lila differently, but sometimes the difference stung. I remember one afternoon, my eldest son brought home a drawing from school. He was so proud, his little fingers tracing the colors he had used. I showed it to my mother first, expecting a gentle smile. She nodded, glanced briefly, and then turned to Lila. "Lila, what do you think of this?" "Do you think he used the right colors?" she asked. And there it was, the unmistakable attention, the subtle message that her opinion mattered more than mine. I smiled anyway, hiding the ache in my chest. I tried to talk to Lila about it once, gently, over a cup of tea. "Don't you think Mom notices some things more with you?" I asked. She laughed softly, almost too easily, and said, "Maybe, but that's just Mom. She loves us both." I wanted to believe her. I needed to. Life went on quietly. My days were filled with school runs, meals, and bedtime stories. I liked the simplicity, the rhythm of our small world. But even in these moments of peace, I felt a shadow of tension, a whisper that something was shifting beneath the surface. My mother seemed distracted at times, her eyes lingering on Lila a little longer, her words a little warmer. I told myself it was nothing, but a small, persistent knot of worry had formed in my chest. I remember one rainy afternoon when Lila came over unannounced. She stood in the doorway, dripping wet, smiling that same perfect smile. My mother immediately fussed over her, drying her hair, insisting she have tea and snacks. I watched from the kitchen counter, my hands busy with dishes, feeling an odd mix of love for my sister and a quiet envy that I couldn't shake. "Mom, can you help me with this?" Lila asked, holding a letter she wanted to send. My mother took it gently, reading aloud, laughing softly at something she said. I stood nearby, unsure whether to interrupt or step back. I sipped my tea and forced a smile, telling myself that I had no right to feel hurt. But the truth was, every smile I offered felt a little strained, every nod a little heavy. Small moments like these became more frequent. My mother would ask Lila's opinion on household matters, on my children's schooling, even on my own choices. I tried to voice my thoughts, but often my words were met with polite nods or a quick, "That's a good idea, dear," before she turned back to Lila. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but I felt it every time. And then came the holidays, the first real test of my patience and my heart. Our family always celebrated together, a tradition I cherished deeply. I spent days preparing meals, decorating the house, making sure everything felt perfect. My mother arrived, as she always did, carrying her warmth and her quiet laughter. But this time she barely looked at me. Lila was there, of course, smiling and chatting, drawing my mother into long conversations, sharing jokes and stories from the past that I hadn't even remembered. At first, I tried to ignore it, focusing on my children's excitement, the glow of the candles, the smell of roasted vegetables. But later, when everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the empty table and thought about the gap between us. The distance was no longer subtle. It was there, unmistakable, a cold, quiet line separating me from the woman I had loved all my life. I asked myself where it had begun. Was it something I had done or not done? Was it always there, hidden under years of smiles and laughter? I didn't know. All I knew was that my mother's gaze lingered on Lila, and I felt invisible. Even my sister seemed unaware, or maybe she was very aware and chose to be. She never made a show of it, never mocked or taunted, but her presence had a way of drawing my mother toward her, leaving me on the edges of the warmth I had always known. I felt a quiet, gnawing sadness, one I didn't know how to name. It wasn't just my mother. Lila began to interfere in small ways with my home. She would arrive at my house with suggestions, sometimes unasked for, offering advice on parenting, on meals, on how I ran my household. At first, I thanked her politely, but I noticed my mother agreeing with her, sometimes even correcting me quietly. I began to feel like a guest in my own life, like someone else's decisions mattered more than mine. I remember one evening, vividly. I was baking bread, my favorite simple joy, and my mother came in to help. Lila arrived just as the dough was rising, and the two of them began to chatter, sharing memories from when we were children. I tried to join in, but my words were met with polite nods, laughter already moving on to Lila's stories. I put down my hands, let the dough rise without me, and stepped into the living room, quietly watching as they laughed together. The warmth that should have included me felt closed off. I began to notice more things. Gifts I had bought for my mother disappeared, replaced with something Lila had chosen. Plans I had made were shifted without consulting me, always aligning with her schedule. My mother never questioned it, or if she did so quietly, allowing Lila to take the lead. And still, no words were spoken between us, only the quiet, unspoken shift that left me feeling small. The tension was always subtle, but it grew, like ivy creeping along a wall, unnoticed until it had covered everything. I tried to remind myself that love is complicated, that families have their favorites sometimes, that perhaps Lila and my mother just shared a bond I couldn't understand. But deep inside, a quiet sorrow settled in my heart, one I carried like a hidden stone. The first real sign that something had shifted irreversibly came during my mother's birthday. I had planned it carefully, baking her favorite cake, decorating the living room with flowers from the garden, and inviting both my children and Lila. I imagined her delight, the soft laughter, the warmth of family gathered together. But the day unfolded differently. Lila arrived first and immediately took over, rearranging the flowers, suggesting a different cake presentation, and even guiding the children in ways I had never instructed. My mother followed along with a quiet smile, nodding at every suggestion. I tried to intervene gently, offering small adjustments, but my words were brushed aside with a soft, "That looks lovely, dear. Let's see how Lila does it." I remember standing there frozen, a slice of cake in my hand, watching my own family celebration slip out of my hands. I wanted to cry, to scream, to demand that they notice my effort, but I stayed silent. I didn't want to create a scene, so I smiled, clapping when everyone did, and took a small, quiet breath. After that day, the small tensions that had always lingered became harder to ignore. Lila's presence in our lives grew more pronounced. She would drop by unannounced, offering unsolicited advice, gently correcting me in front of my children, and always with my mother by her side. I began to dread her visits, yet I never voiced it, because it felt cruel to complain about my own sister. The hardest moments were the small, everyday interactions. One evening, I prepared a special dinner for my mother. I wanted to surprise her, to show her my love through the meals I made, the care I put into every detail. Lila arrived just as I was setting the table. She immediately began rearranging the dishes, pointing out minor details with a gentle smile. My mother watched, nodding, saying, "Yes, that's perfect, Lila." I felt a tight knot in my chest. I wanted to ask her to stop, to let me do this one thing for my mother, but the words caught in my throat. I ate quietly that evening, my heart heavy, my smile forced. Later, when my mother thanked me for the meal, I realized her gratitude had been directed toward Lila more than me, though she tried to hide it. These incidents became frequent. Lila would speak to my mother privately, leaving me out of conversations that had always included me. She would compliment my mother's appearance, her cooking, her home, while making subtle suggestions that I should follow her example. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself I was imagining things, but deep inside, the hurt grew heavier each day. One afternoon, my mother called me with a question about an upcoming family gathering. I suggested a plan I had carefully thought out, only for her to reply, "Let me check with Lila. She has some ideas too." I froze. My voice caught as I said, "I thought you wanted my opinion first?" There was a pause and then a quiet, "Of course, dear. But Lila might know better." I hung up the phone, hands trembling, tears threatening to fall. I wanted to scream at the injustice, at the slow, creeping way I had been sidelined. But I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the empty house, listening to the ticking of the clock, feeling the quiet ache of being unnoticed by the woman I had loved most. The tension wasn't just between Lila and me. It began to affect my relationship with my children. They noticed the subtle shifts, the quiet sighs, the forced smiles. They would ask, "Mom, why does Grandma always spend more time with Lila?" And I would laugh softly, brushing it off, but inside, I felt a pang of guilt for not protecting them from the emotional weight of favoritism. I tried to reach out to my mother directly, asking her to notice my efforts, to include me in the small moments. But every attempt was met with gentle dismissal or redirection. "You worry too much, dear. Lila just helps in her own way." The words were calm, but they stung, a reminder that I was no longer at the center of my mother's affection. Even the holidays became a battlefield of quiet emotions. I would plan decorations, gifts, and meals, only to see Lila subtly change things, and my mother would follow along without question. At first I tried to smile, to enjoy the company, but the pattern was clear. Lila's influence had grown, and my presence felt increasingly optional. One night, after a particularly painful visit, I sat alone in my room, holding a letter my mother had written years ago. It was full of love, memories, and small reassurances that I had always cherished. I read it over and over, hoping to feel that warmth again. But the words now seemed distant, almost like a memory of love, not the living, breathing affection I had once felt. The breaking point came during my son's school performance. I had helped him practice for weeks, cheering him on, reminding him to stand tall and speak clearly. I had envisioned my mother smiling proudly at him, just as she had smiled at me when I was a child. When the performance began, I watched from the front row, my heart swelling with pride. But then I noticed my mother's attention was entirely on Lila. She clapped for every small gesture Lila made, whispered comments to her, and hardly glanced at my son. I felt invisible, a ghost, sitting in my own family's celebration. I wanted to storm out, to demand that my mother see me, see my children, see all the love I had poured into this family. But instead I stayed quiet, clapping politely, feeling a slow, heavy ache settle into my chest. I realized then that this wasn't just favoritism. It was deliberate, subtle, and it cut deeper than I had ever imagined. Even Lila began to act with more confidence, more control. She would offer advice on my parenting, on my choices, on the way I ran my home, and my mother, always eager to please, began to follow her guidance, leaving me feeling like I had lost not only my place, but my voice. There were moments when I questioned myself. Was I being overly sensitive? Was I imagining this favoritism? But deep down I knew the truth. The quiet, creeping exclusion, the subtle corrections, the way my mother's gaze lingered on Lila more than me, it was real. And it was intentional. I began to withdraw. Not entirely, but enough to notice the growing distance. I stopped inviting my mother to small gatherings, stopped sharing minor achievements, because I knew they would be overshadowed. I wanted to protect my heart from further pain, but the isolation only made the ache more profound. The final straw came one evening when my mother called me. "Lila says she can handle the arrangements for your father's memorial," she said. My heart skipped a beat. This was my family, my home, my memories, and she was letting Lila take the lead. I tried to protest gently, reminding her that it was my responsibility, that I wanted to honor my father in my own way. But her voice remained calm, almost detached. "Lila has experience, dear. Let her help. It will be easier for everyone." I hung up the phone, staring at the wall, feeling a quiet rage and sorrow that I couldn't express. I realized then that the bond I had cherished with my mother had been quietly, deliberately shifted toward my sister, and there was nothing I could do to reclaim it. The days that followed were heavy with quiet sorrow. I watched as my mother and Lila planned, laughed, and shared memories that had once been mine. I was there physically, but my heart felt miles away, carried by a tide of exclusion and silent betrayal. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. I had planned to take my mother for a walk in the park, something we had done for years, a tradition that I had always cherished. I imagined her soft laughter, the warmth of her hand in mine, and the simple joy of sharing a morning together. But when I arrived at her house, the door was already open. Lila was there, smiling, and my mother was following her lead, holding a small bag that Lila had packed. "Good morning," Lila chirped. "We're going to the park. You should join us." I froze for a moment. I had not been consulted. My heart sank. I thought I would take her," I said gently, trying not to sound upset. "Oh, that's sweet. But we already planned this," Lila said lightly, brushing past me. My mother smiled awkwardly, a little flustered, and nodded. "Yes, let's go," she said. without a hint of hesitation. I felt a cold wave of disbelief and sorrow. The walk had been our tradition, a quiet connection that I thought was ours alone. And now, without a word, it had been claimed by my sister. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. My mother was smiling at Lila, chatting easily, as if I were invisible. I realized then that the exclusion was no longer subtle. It was deliberate, and it cut deeper than anything I had felt before. I stepped back, quietly closing the door behind me, and walked home in silence. The streets were wet from overnight rain, the clouds heavy and gray, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I couldn't stop the tears from welling up, even though I tried. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, and for the first time, I felt a quiet anger mixed with sadness. Over the next few days, the tension escalated. Lila began to involve my mother in decisions about my own home. Minor things at first, like suggesting changes in furniture placement or the way I organized the kitchen. Then came more personal matters, including advice about my children, about finances, even about my own choices in life. My mother, always eager to avoid conflict, agreed quietly, following Lila's guidance. I tried to speak up. One evening, I sat down with my mother and said softly, "Mom, I feel like Lila is taking over in ways that affect my family. Can we talk about it?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. I didn't realize it felt that way to you," she said quietly. I thought Lila was helping." "But it's not just help, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "She's taking my place. She's taking the moments that used to be mine with you." There was a long pause. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the discomfort of choosing between us. But then she said softly, almost apologetically, "I don't mean to hurt you. I feel closer to Lila lately. I don't know why." The words hit me like a quiet storm. I had always believed that love could be measured by actions, by shared time, by care. But now I realize that sometimes love can shift, quietly and irrevocably, without explanation or fault. I wanted to cry, to beg, to ask her to see me, to choose me, but instead I stayed calm. I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I understand, Mom," I said softly, though inside, my heart was breaking. That evening, I went home and sat alone, letting the tears flow freely. I thought about the years I had spent nurturing my relationship with my mother, the countless meals, the quiet conversations, the small acts of love that I had poured into our bond. And I realized that none of it mattered in the face of this subtle, growing favoritism. Then came the most painful moment. Lila called me, her voice light, almost cheerful. "We've decided to redecorate Mom's room. You don't need to worry about it. I'll handle everything." I froze. My mother had agreed. She was letting Lila decide how her own home would look. I wanted to shout, to demand that my mother reconsider, but the words died in my throat. I realized that confrontation wouldn't change anything. The bond I had cherished, the shared love, had shifted in ways I could not reverse. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the photographs on the walls, images of my mother, my sister, my children. They told stories of love, of family, of shared memories, but the memories now felt tainted by exclusion, by the quiet betrayal that had grown over years. I thought about the mornings, the birthdays, the holidays, and I realized that every moment I had once felt secure in was now fragile, claimed by someone else. The next day, I found myself avoiding my mother's house. I told myself it was for my own peace, but in truth, it was a protective measure, a way to shield my heart from further pain. Every visit, every interaction was now a reminder of the distance, the unspoken preference, the love that seemed to have been quietly shifted to my sister. One evening, my son came to me, eyes wide with concern. "Mom, why doesn't Grandma sit with us anymore? Why does she always want to be with Lila?" I held him close, feeling the sorrow deep in my chest. "I don't know, sweetheart," I whispered. "Sometimes adults make choices we don't understand. But we'll be okay, I promise." It was then I realized that the impact was not just on me. It was on my children, on the little world I had tried so hard to protect. The quiet exclusion that had started as subtle hurt had now rippled outward, affecting everyone I loved. The breaking point came fully when my mother, without warning, told me that she had signed over certain decisions about her finances and home management to Lila. I sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how quickly, quietly, the control I had thought we shared had been handed over. "Mom, you didn't even ask me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," she said softly, "but I trust Lila to handle things. It's easier for everyone." And in that moment, I understood that this was not temporary, not a misunderstanding. It was permanent, deliberate, and it cut deeper than any words could express. I felt a quiet grief, the kind that settles into your bones, a sorrow that leaves no room for anger, only realization. I spent the night alone, reflecting on my life, my family, and the years I had devoted to love and care. I thought about my sister, about my mother, and about myself. And I realized that the story of our family had changed, quietly, subtly, irrevocably. I could not undo the shift, nor could I reclaim the bond that had once been mine. But as I sat there, tears falling softly onto the floor, a small thought began to take shape. Perhaps this was not the end of love, but a new beginning. Perhaps the way forward was not through confrontation or resentment, but through acceptance and quiet strength. I knew then that I had to find a way to live in this new reality, to protect my heart, to continue loving my children, and to carry the memory of my bond with my mother as a quiet, sacred part of my life, even if it could never be what it once was. The days that followed the turning point were heavy with quiet grief. I moved through my life like someone carrying a small, hidden weight. Every visit to my mother's house, every phone call, reminded me of the distance that had grown between us. And yet, I realized that anger or resentment wouldn't help me. It would only make the sorrow sharper. I began to focus on the parts of my life that were still mine. My children, my home, the small routines that had always brought me peace, cooking, gardening, reading letters from old friends. I found comfort in the rhythm of these small acts, and slowly, a quiet strength began to grow inside me. It wasn't easy. I would sometimes sit in the living room after a visit, staring at the photographs on the wall, remembering moments I had cherished with my mother, moments that now seemed like fragments of a different life. I allowed myself to cry, to grieve, to feel the absence of the closeness I had once taken for granted. I also began writing. At first it was just a small journal, a place to pour out my thoughts, my pain, my confusion. But over time, the writing became a sanctuary. I wrote letters I never intended to send, speaking honestly to my mother, my sister, and even to myself. I expressed feelings I had buried for years, sadness, disappointment, longing, and yes, even love. The act of writing allowed me to release some of the quiet ache that had settled in my heart. I started to notice small changes in my perspective. I realized that my mother's love had shifted, yes, but it was not the same as losing her completely. I could still share moments with her, even if they were filtered through Lila's presence. I could still call her, sit with her, and cherish the times we had left. I began to treasure the small smiles, the brief conversations, the quiet acknowledgement of my presence, even if it was no longer as warm or frequent as it once had been. There were moments of hesitation, of self-doubt. I would ask myself if I should confront Lila, if I should demand my place back, if I should fight for recognition. But each time I realized that confrontation would only create more pain. My sister had claimed a role in my mother's life, whether intentionally or not, and my energy was better spent preserving my own peace and nurturing the relationships I could influence, my children, my home, and myself. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, I went into my garden. The flowers were blooming, the air smelled of rain and earth, and for a moment, the world felt still and kind. I thought about my mother, about my sister, and about the life I had lived. I realized that while I could not change the past or control their choices, I could control my own heart. I could choose how to respond, how to nurture myself, and how to protect my children from the subtle pains I had endured. I also began to reach out to friends I had neglected, people who had always been a source of warmth and support. I realized that love exists in many forms, and sometimes it comes from unexpected places. The quiet kindness of a friend, the laughter shared over tea, the simple presence of someone who listens. These became my new anchors. Over time, I found ways to maintain a connection with my mother that felt genuine, even if it was different from what I had once known. I would call her in the mornings, chat about small daily events, share photographs of my children. I learned to appreciate the moments we had, no longer measuring them against the closeness I had lost, but valuing them for what they were. My sister's presence remained a quiet challenge. Lila had taken a role in my mother's life that I could not reclaim, and I had to accept that. But acceptance did not mean bitterness. Instead, I focused on boundaries, on protecting my peace, and on nurturing the parts of my life that brought me genuine joy. I discovered that strength often comes quietly, in small acts of self-care and reflection, rather than in grand confrontations. I also found moments of understanding for my mother. I realized that her love, though shifted, was still there, in ways I could see if I chose to notice. She had been human, influenced by the people around her, and sometimes her actions had unintentionally hurt me. I began to forgive, not because I had to, but because it lightened the weight I had carried for so long. Forgiveness allowed me to release some of the quiet sorrow, to breathe again, and to see my mother not as someone who had abandoned me, but as someone navigating her own heart, just as I was navigating mine. One afternoon, my mother invited me to help her bake cookies. Lila was absent that day, busy with errands, and we were alone in the kitchen. I watched as my mother measured flour and stirred batter, her hands steady, her smile gentle. And in that moment, I felt a small warmth, a flicker of the bond we had shared. I didn't demand more. I didn't expect a return to the closeness of old times. I simply allowed myself to sit in the quiet joy of being together, fully present, without expectation. I realized then that love can exist even when it is imperfect, even when it shifts and changes over time. I learned that relationships do not always follow the paths we imagine, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in acceptance and quiet resilience. I also came to understand my own worth. Independent of my mother's attention or my sister's influence, I was still a mother, a caregiver, a woman with my own heart and my own life. I still had love to give, memories to cherish, and small joys to savor. And in that understanding, I began to feel a lightness I hadn't known in years, not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. As the years went on, I learned to live with the quiet shifts in my family. I could not change my mother's heart, nor could I reclaim the moments that had quietly slipped away. But I could shape my own life, and I could teach my children what love, patience, and resilience truly meant. I began to see that even in the pain of loss and exclusion, there was space for gratitude. I was grateful for the memories I had shared with my mother, for the lessons learned through hardship, and for the strength that had quietly grown inside me. I was grateful for my children, who loved me unconditionally, and for the small joys of life, the laughter that filled our home, the warmth of morning sunlight, the smell of fresh bread from the oven. Sometimes I would sit quietly in my mother's living room while she and Lila talked about old memories. I no longer felt the sharp sting of exclusion. Instead, I would watch them, allowing myself to smile softly, feeling a quiet peace in knowing that love can take many forms. I had learned to share it without expectation, to accept what I could not control, and to protect the parts of my heart that were mine alone. I also learned to forgive, not for their sake, but for my own. Forgiveness did not erase the hurt, but it lifted the weight I had carried for so many years. It allowed me to breathe, to see clearly, and to focus on the relationships that mattered most, with my children, with myself, and with the moments of connection I could still have with my mother. One day, as I watched my youngest child play in the garden, I realized how much I had grown. The pain that had once felt overwhelming had transformed into quiet strength. I had learned that love is not a limited resource, that it can exist in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest love we give is the love we offer ourselves. Life is imperfect. People change, relationships shift, and yet even in the most difficult moments, there is beauty to be found if we are willing to look for it. I carry the lessons of my journey quietly in my heart. that patience and acceptance can bring peace, that boundaries are a form of self-respect, and that hope is always possible. Even when life feels heavy, I still visit my mother. I still share moments with her. And though the bond we have is no longer the same as it once was, it is still meaningful in its own quiet way. My sister remains a part of her life, and I have learned to exist alongside that. Without bitterness, without resentment, holding my own life and love close to my heart. And in this quiet understanding, I found a gentle kind of happiness. Not the kind that comes from being chosen or noticed first, but the kind that comes from knowing my worth, cherishing what I have, and allowing love, in all its imperfect forms, to fill the spaces it can. I have learned, finally, that even when someone takes what we once held dear, they cannot take the strength, the memories, or the love that resides quietly in our own hearts. And that, perhaps, is the most profound lesson of all.